Chuck Close is one of the world's most celebrated portrait artists. He's exhibited in places like the Museum of Modern Art, the Tate Modern, and the Pompidou. He's also blind. Well, not exactly blind. He can see the world like most people, just not faces. He has a form of perceptual condition called prosopagnosia. He doesn't even recognize people he knows well, not by their faces anyway, not even his own. How he paints is ingenious. He breaks down photographs into a grid and works off individual squares. I'll let you do the research if you're at all interested. I tell you about Chuck because of the way he provides insight into today's text. His condition renders him incapable of seeing something that's all around him. Ours does too. Prosopagnosia makes Chuck incapable of seeing faces. Impurity of heart makes us incapable of seeing God. That's what's implied in Jesus' statement, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." Now, to understand a text like today's, we need to see that ideas of purity and impurity, things like innocence, spotlessness, or contamination and pollution, have migrated from one area of our understanding to another domain entirely, where they once applied to morality and to our spiritual condition. They're now used almost exclusively in a scientific sense, having to do with the way foreign elements compromise or harm some specimen or system. Linguistic vestiges of that older way of thinking remain, of course, in the way that we sometimes speak. That guy's a real dirtbag, or a slime ball, or my hands are clean. But in the main, people don't really think about morality in terms of cleanliness or purity anymore. Whether that's a helpful idea, I don't know. Just to say, it's worth noting because of the way it can conceal what Jesus is trying to show us. His general point seems straightforward enough, that there's a connection between the condition of our hearts and our perceptual faculties, specifically our ability to see the most important thing that there is, God. And because purity is no longer found in our ideas or concepts about morality, it's worth trying to understand what might have been meant by describing our spiritual condition in those terms. Otherwise, we risk missing what's at stake in allowing moral contaminants to pollute our lives, whatever they turn out to be. We can start by looking at the way these ideas show up today, and then working backwards, trying to see if those contemporary examples illuminate older ways of thinking. That's what I'm going to try to do. So today, we encounter purity in two places. First, think of images you've seen on BBC documentaries. A museum staff holding ancient texts. They wear gloves. And if the document is ancient or valuable or fragile enough, they sometimes don't even touch it. They use sterilized instruments to manipulate the pages instead. The reason has to do with purity, with the way that foreign elements like the oils on our skin or the chemicals from our soap can corrode the paper over time. Or think about people you've seen working with radioactive materials. Maybe you've done it yourself. They cover themselves in hazmat suits to protect themselves from the radiation, from the exposure to that harm. The idea has to do with purity, with the way that exposing yourself to something harmful outside can harm something inside, corrupting it or making us unwell. That's one way that we think about purity and impurity today. But there's another way. The easiest example is also a biblical one. It has to do with elemental purity, with the purity of precious metals like gold, and the metallurgic process of removing impure elements, dross, by exposing it to extreme heat. This idea of purity, it's seen elsewhere too. The main being pollution and the distorting effects on the climate and on our ecosystem that comes from overwhelming it with contaminants. This idea of purity is internal. It has to do with adulteration, purity in the sense of being unalloyed or unmixed. Something is pure in this sense when there are no foreign elements blended in. And when they are, they need to come out. In the case of pollution, because of the harm that it wreaks on our ecosystem, and with gold, because the way that those foreign elements detract from its beauty, its rarity, and its worth. So purity works in both ways, from the inside out and from the outside in. Now back to our spiritual lives. I think the idea is that there can be things internal to us, ideas, attitudes, values, ambitions that impede the way that we're supposed to function, in the sense that they cause our internal processes to malfunction, or they make us unwell, or they limit our ability to live in the way that we ought. Other times, we can come into contact with external things, and they have a similarly negative effect, by which I mean that there are some things in the moral universe that are hazardous. They undermine, they diminish us. A useful illustration here is cataracts, which are impurities that form over our eyes as the result of exposure to radiation, from the sun. Something similar to that can happen in our psycho-spiritual moral faculties. The question is, what might some of those things be, and what should we do about them? I'll come back to that. First, I just want to be clear. Jesus' concern here is with our flourishing and with the way that impurity can compromise our capacity to see the most valuable and important thing, by which I think he means God, God's truth, God's goodness, God's beauty, God's presence in the world, God's guidance, the ability to recognize where God is at work, or maybe feel God's nearness in times of suffering, all of which are essential to our flourishing. What he's not doing is using purity to coerce us into obeying some kind of legalistic set of rules. That's not his game. Now, Chuck Close found a way to deal with his inability to see faces by breaking down photographs into tiny pieces. That's not how we confront our God blindness. For us, the solution is different. It's to seek purity of heart, continually practicing a discipline of self-diagnosis and identifying those impurities in our life and asking God to help us address them. Internal purities might include ideas about ourselves, maybe that we're not lovable, that we're not intelligent, that we have nothing to contribute or no purpose, that nobody cares about us, or maybe that you're smarter or better, that your race or your class or your education, your nationality or your gender somehow make you superior, that others are below you. It might include values like caring more about pleasure than about your neighbor, or valuing things more than the environment, or valuing your own interests over being Christ-like. There's endless possibilities. The point is, they all impede our ability to see God, and therefore to know God, and enjoy God, and follow God. There are external things too. We can become embroiled in social relations that are defiling, like being subject to certain kinds of abuse or disrespect. We can join groups or parties whose ideas are counter to Jesus' kingdom. We can participate in cultural practices that harm vulnerable people, or consumerist practices that destroy our world. Sometimes such things even filter into the church, where we esteem gifted people over the giver of those gifts, where we reduce worship to commodity, where we pretend that the good news of Jesus' gospel is about me. It's about my individual benefit, the gifts God's give me, the prosperity he promises. Those things are impure because they twist and divert. They mix in elements that undermine our ability to see God's truth and God's goodness. Now, Jesus' gospel is about God's inbreaking kingdom. That kingdom has a culture. That's what we're talking about. It has a way of acting and behaving that results in makarios, in the life satisfaction that comes from living as you were created to live. One of the practices central to that life, one of the practices of the kingdom, involves acknowledging and confronting, both individually and as a community together, those things that leave us blind, and to correct them with God's help. The psalmist gives us a prayer expressing the heart of this practice in Psalm 51. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Don't isolate me from your presence. Don't take away your Holy Spirit from me, but make my heart willing to be more like you. What results, the psalmist says, foreshadows Jesus' own promise, that we'll know the joy of our salvation, that we'll find happiness. My hope is that we'll internalize this aspiration, this prayer, that we'd make it our own, and that God would heal our blindnesses, enabling us to know the joy of his salvation more fully as a result. See you next time.